So everybody, welcome Dr. Michael Heiser, and it's an honor to have you on. And just like to let you introduce yourself in any way you want, and or tell us your motivation behind writing The Unseen Realm.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you for having me. I hope you still have somebody in the audience that's awake after that.
It's a little rambling.
Oh well, it's not the most exciting stuff, I guess. But as far as motivation, it despite all the degrees and all that sort of thing, I mean, the motivation is actually pretty simple. When I had my sort of own awakening or epiphany in graduate school that, hey, this is a profound thought, that the right context for understanding the Bible isn't mine, or isn't anything modern, and it's not the Reformation, it's not Catholicism, it's not fill in the blank, it's the context that actually produced the thing. But once you sort of are confronted in different ways with that necessity to do that, and in my case it was graduate work. I mean, they just don't let you sort of filter the data through your tradition. I mean, they insist that you look at the data in its own context, and so once you do that, it drives people different ways. And for me, it was just fascinating, that there were lots of strange passages once I sort of could commit myself to, this is how I'm going to look at Scripture, and I'm going to look at it unfiltered from my own traditions and unfiltered from creeds and confessions and whatnot. And the point is not that I'm hostile to those things. I think they have a purpose, but they are not, again, the correct context for understanding what a biblical writer wanted to communicate. I mean, we're 2,000 or more years removed from a lot of this stuff in the Bible, and so if we don't have the ancient Israelite in our head, there's no way that we can comprehend the precise points that the writer wanted us to pick up on, when we read what he wrote. I mean, just these are very simple presuppositions, but you have to commit yourself to doing that, and frankly, there's a price to be paid for it, because it does make people feel uncomfortable, but it has a tremendous payoff. If your goal is to understand, sort of to master the content of this thing we call the Bible, then it's necessary. And I enjoyed it. I saw lots of payoff to it, but it soon became very apparent to me that, the way scholars talk about the Bible and the way you hear about the Bible talked about in church, there's just a great gulf between those two things, and it just didn't feel right for me to sort of be enjoying the payoff of being able to do this, the languages and all the stuff you have to do in graduate school, and then the average person in the pew doesn't get any of it. So I thought very early on, while I was in grad school, it's like, I think I can do this. I think I can make scholarship decipherable to the normal person, the person that wasn't a geek, like me. I think I can do that. And so that became the motivation, here we are 15 years later, for what is now known as The Unseen Realm. So it's been a long haul. The book, I still view the book as a starting point.
Mm-hmm.
The book is an academic work, but it's very readable. I had a really good editor. It's very readable, but it's still just saying, like, let's just get the lay of the land here, all the things that we need to sort of think about, and then I have plenty of material for at least one more, maybe two, books like it. But this is sort of the entry point where, if you had a lot of this stuff in your head, you would read the Bible really again for the first time. I mean, it's just things are gonna pop out at you. You'll see more interconnections, because you'll be reading it like an ancient person would have been thinking, more than you could, without this sort of material.
Most definitely. And if you allow me a moment to go into actually how, from my personal perspective, maybe connect with the audience here from a layman's perspective, how this has really affected me. And it's affected me more ways than one. I'll probably discuss a little more of that later when we get to the ancient astronaut stuff. But basically, one thing that caught my eye, I was probably in like high school or something.
Mm-hmm.
I was reading the Bible, and I suddenly came, and when you're just reading the Bible, just like you're not reading the typical, doesn't necessarily the typical passages, you're just reading the Bible, even if you just kind of start opening to a random page and just start reading. Sometimes you'll find these little weird things in there that just like shake you and just like, what is this? And this shook me more than anything. And I think at the time I just had the NIV. It was a typical youth group, the translation we used in our youth group and stuff. And even this translation had this interesting way of translating this very first verse of Psalm 82. And it says, God, first of all, Psalm of Asaph. I was like, who's Asaph? And then I was like, God presides in the great assembly. He renders judgment among the gods. That right there, I stopped for a second and was like, okay, wait a second. I know we have angels and demons. What are these, like, okay, the gods? Like, what's going on here? And then later on it goes, the gods know nothing, they understand nothing, they walk about in darkness. And I was like, are these people? Are these certain select types of people? Or are they? And there's all these questions just swimming through my mind. But whatever interpretation it was, I knew that there was something to this verse, this passage, that was like life altering. And I was like, either if it's saying that there are certain humans that are divine, or if it's saying that there are like these supernatural beings that are like the gods of the other cultures are real, but that they're being shaken to the core and they're going to die like mere men, whatever. And obviously we're going to inherit eternal life, so there's something to like we're going to be exalted over them somehow. And I wasn't definitely wasn't as clear and cogent as the way you presented. It was just like these kind of hints, like whatever the case was, like, this is so cool, and I pinned it to my wall above my bed. I had it up there for like years, at least a year or two, I don't know. And then later on, I was reading the NET Bible. I purchased it, and it was like I was so curious about all these different little nuances of the text. This huge, thick Bible, and sometimes the footnotes would take up most of the page, but they had a little note in there, and I have a link to it here, and some notes I put. But basically, it says, if I can pull it up. Shoot, I thought I would go right to it here.
Is it a text note, or because I have the Net Bible here in my software?
Oh yeah, I have pulled up here. The psalmist pictures God standing in the assembly of El, where he accuses the gods of failing to promote justice on earth. And I was like, what? And then like then it goes on, the present translation assumes the Hebrew term Elohim refers to the pagan gods who supposedly comprise El's assembly according to the Canaanite religion. Those who reject the polemical view of the psalm, blah, 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 refer to as human rulers. But I was like, the Canaanite gods? Where does Canaanite theology come in? All? Like, why are we importing that? Like, why do we need that? Like, that's so weird. But then I started those sort of hints started percolating, and it wasn't until I discovered your work that it really started to crystallize for me. So,
well, you were way ahead of the game. I mean, if you got to Psalm 82:1 and you didn't just close your Bible or go to something else, you're way ahead of the game.
Well, I thought that stuff was cool, and it did shake me before, but I've always been about like not hiding from things that are kind of weird, and it's helped, even if it's been a little uncomfortable. And it's kind of maybe a little bit of an outsider sometimes when I see some of this stuff.
Yeah, well, join the club, just no, seriously. I mean, I'm just used to. I mean, now I get to present, some of these things, in different settings, and of course, lots of podcasts, or whatever. But when it's live, you always get that look like people are looking at you like you got two heads, and you just, you just kind of get used to it. But my thing is, look, hey, I didn't write this stuff, I study it. I'm not responsible for the content, but this is actually your Bible.
Right.
So you got to do something with it, and hide. I don't suggest hiding from it. I mean, let's think about it. Psalm 82:1. Surely Jesus knew this verse. Of course he does. He quotes Psalm 82:6 in John 10. Surely Paul knew this. and they weren't freaked out by it. They didn't like just quit. What
Hmm.
they're going out, to tell people about the Messiah. And one guy says, "Hey, I read Psalm 82 this morning, and I'm done." they, they don't do that. So I mean, there's got to be some cogent, answer to this. How do we look at this? And it's not something as really silly and artificial as, oh, the gods here must be people. Again, if you say that to yourself 5 times and see if it doesn't sound dumb after the
Right.
fifth time, it's just ridiculous. But that's what a lot of people will say again to allow them, and they think, to put the psalm on the shelf. And I'm glad I don't have to think about that anymore.
Yeah.
But if you go to Psalm 89, you can't get away with that, because
Hmm.
Psalm 82:6, God says to the other gods in the council, I said, "You are gods, all of you, sons of the Most High." The B'nai Elyon, well, we know that's sons of God because the Most High has to be the God of Israel. Then you go over to Psalm 89, there you have the sons of God in a council, in an assembly. I mean, these are all terms that are used in Psalm 89, and it's in the clouds. So, like the last time I checked my Bible, we don't have a group of men like ruling the nations from the clouds. I mean, it's just absurd. But very few people will even give it that 45 seconds that I just spent explaining that. They won't even give the passage that much time. They'll be content with something artificial that allows them to no longer think about it, and away they go. And that's just a mistake, because Psalm 82 is at the core of what I call in the book the Divine Council worldview. It's actually just one component of a very important understanding of how biblical writers viewed the unseen realm, viewed the supernatural world, and this is a core element. And so, if you don't want to follow that trajectory, you're going to miss other things that this hooks into or that this contributes to. So that there is a domino effect in terms of your ability to understand lots of other passages. If
Hmm.
you just start gutting, think about what I'm going to think about this statement. If you start gutting the Bible of its supernaturalism, you know, but that's what a lot of Christians do.
Yeah.
They are selectively supernatural, and it just,
Even.
I was there too, so I can't be too hard. But on the other hand, I have come to the point where I just refuse to any longer protect people from their Bible. You don't need to be protected from your Bible.
Even coming from a Pentecostal background, which I was raised, there is still like kind of an arm's length
Hmm.
approach to some stuff because, well, there's still a fear that you're just going to be dabbling into the occult or stuff like that. Even
Yeah,
and that
I
is
don't
proven.
understand the interpretation for this, so it must be the occult.
Yeah,
Just
exactly.
like, really.
There is a heightened fear, definitely, and amongst those who are trying to be cautious, and that there's a room for caution for sure.
Hmm.
But there's also a heightened fear, even in charismatic circles, and so you'll still get some of that arm's length attitude. But I mean, those I haven't experienced in that context the sort of the over, like you were describing in the book, the rationalistic. Well, we live in God in the virgin birth and stuff like that,
Hmm.
but almost everything else is
Yeah.
there was still definitely an openness to demonic activity and angelic activity and stuff like that. But
Well, I mean, I understand, and what if people are patient enough, especially like to sort of hear me out, or make it through chapter 3 of the book, if they're patient enough to do that, I understand it, because when we see the letters G, O, and D, okay, because we're Western, because we have an accumulated body of Christian tradition in our heads, our minds immediately assign a specific set of attributes to the letters G, O, and D. And that's why we get creeped out when you add an S to it. Because mentally, when we see God, we think, oh, omniscience, omnipotence, sovereignty, creator, all these things. And the disconnect is a biblical writer would not have done that with the word Elohim.
right.
they're going to use the word Elohim, and they're not mentally assigning a specific set of unique attributes to it. And you say, well, how do you know that, Mike? Well, we know that because of the way they do use Elohim. They call 6 different things Elohim, and they know that they're not all the same. I mean, the one I love is 1 Samuel 28:13, when the disembodied, dead Samuel, it has this conversation with Saul, the medium at Endor passage. Well, that's very common language in the ancient world, both within and outside the Bible, that you view, like Ugaritic text call the deceased ancestors Elim and Elohim all the time.
Hmm.
And it doesn't mean that they think that they've joined the pantheon now. What it refers to is that now you are by nature disembodied. You are part of the spiritual world. That's why Elohim in the Bible can be the God of Israel, it can be gods of the nations, it can be goddesses, it can be the Shadim in Deuteronomy 32:17, which are usually translated demons. It's not really the demons like we see in the Gospels, but they're territorial spirits. You have the disembodied dead Samuel, you have the angel of the Lord. All these things are Elohim. No Israelite in their right mind would think, oh, my dear departed dead uncle is now the same as the God of Israel. I mean, it's just absurd. But yet all of those things are called Elohim. So that tells you it has nothing to do with attributes, the way we think of G, O, and D. So it doesn't matter if you have plural Elohim. It's just a term you would use that I would call something an Elohim if it by nature belongs in the disembodied spiritual world. Now in that world there is rank. There is hierarchy. There is differentiation. This is why I say in the book, Yahweh, the God of Israel, is an Elohim, but no other Elohim is Yahweh. He is different, and he gets described in ways that no other Elohim get described, but yet they all are called by the same term. So, if people are patient enough to listen to that, and you show them examples, a lot of people say, okay, I get it. Monotheism might be kind of an awkward term, and it is a modern term. It was coined in the 17th century. So it might not quite capture what's going on here, but the spirit of it does, that Yahweh is unique, and that's really why we, use words like monotheism to say the God of the Bible is different, ontologically different than anything else in the spirit world. So our theology is intact. It's just that we have a better understanding of the text. We don't need to fear this, and it's going to matter later on in some other passages.
Right. And if I can give kind of a classical theology touch to this, this is traditional for Christianity, is that God is the essence of existence, and we see that with his appearance to Moses saying, "I am that I am," and God, in order to create lesser beings, God donates his, he's the essence of existence, and he donates his being so that there are created beings in participation with him, and so it makes sense that if God does this for him to call these beings his offspring, his sons, to me that I actually kind of just made that connection, but that's a very traditional. And I'm not saying the divine council stuff is part of traditional Christianity, but as far as the classical theology element, so just trying to maybe give that bridge to people who do realize that.
Yeah, it's family language, and
Right.
and the family language is really important because the same language is used of humans. I mean, it's not a coincidence that when we get to the New Testament, John says, as many as received him, Jesus, to them he gave the authority to become the sons of God. It's no accident that the Bible uses adoption terminology. You're adopted into God's family as his sons and daughters. Behold what manner of love the Father has bestowed upon us, that we should be called the sons of God.
Oh my gosh.
And that is what we are, John adds in 1 John 3. So you have family terms, you've got adoption terms, you've got inheritance terms, again, used of us. All of these terms that Christians are familiar with because they spend most of their time in the New Testament have a deep history, a deep background in the Old Testament. And if you start stripping the supernatural talk out of those passages, you lose the sense that, hey, guess what? What was Eden? It was the place where heaven met earth. It
Right.
was God's intention to have his non-human family that according to Job 38:7 was there before we were, before humans were. He wanted a blended family. He wanted his divine family to be with his human family in the same place where he was, and they both of them are his imagers. They both get to participate with him in whatever respective realm they're in, whatever God wants them to do, and then enjoy the benefits of his created world
Right.
all together. And eventually humanity was going to be made divine. And think about if the fall would have never happened. Again, this is a very old Christian discourse here.
Mm.
But you have, since it did happen after the fact, we get divinization talk, we get glorification talk, we get theosis talk in the New Testament. Why? Because it was humanity's original destiny to
Right.
be embodied divine beings.
Right.
Okay, now and we're working into the future, back to the past, essentially. That's the story of the Bible. We move ahead to the past, But all of these things again have histories. They have backstories, and we can't really get the full picture of why God talks about us in Scripture the way He does
Mm-hmm.
if we don't understand a lot of this language on its own terms. And unfortunately, what we've done is we've neutered a lot of the language. We've dismissed it. We've stripped the supernatural out of a number of key passages because they're strange, and we get a dimmer view of what God wants us to know. It's not like you can't figure out the gospel if you haven't read Mike's
Right.
book. I mean, that isn't the point at all. But it's the difference between analog and HD. Okay, if you learn to have the Israelite in your head, you will see connections in
Oh yeah.
places you couldn't even imagine that are there. And
Oh,
that is what I'm trying to do in the book. I'm trying to get the Israelite in your head so that you read it like he thought it when he was prompted by God to write it.
right. This is explosive stuff, and this is like kind of the doorway into hopefully
Mm-hmm.
getting more and more Christians into this. And once we do, we will really see this in full HD color, like you're saying, like in imaginative ways, and produce it like through media and to the culture and into the church, and just like there's so much here, so much richness, and
Yeah.
when you really dive into this, it will change. It has the potential to really change your spiritual life. And a little talk about being ahead of the curve. I mean, I'm not trying to put myself on a pedestal here, but because I'm really just trying to give some background on some of the ways that, curiously, let me put it this way. If this stuff is true, then we would expect that God would be introducing it through different venues. And so I never had the scriptural theology behind it. All I knew was that at one point God was starting to, like, as I was more and more trying to seek Him and give surrender my will to Him, He was showing me, like, your destiny will be so great and it'll be like so powerful. And I was getting kind of images of just like stuff that could only be described as like just divine. And I was like, what? Like, God, I can't accept this. This is too much. This is like uh, this is beyond like beyond any kind of narcissistic egoism you could ever
You
get.
mean you thought about your destiny as more than like playing harps for a million years or something like that? I
Exactly.
mean, honestly, is Christianity, the way that people describe heaven, it's like, holy cow, that's boring. I mean,
Right.
it's kind of mind-numbingly repetitious, the way it's described. But if you start to view it in Edenic terms, again, that you're inhabiting the same space as God's other family, the divine family, and you're part of that. And not only that, but we actually have a higher status because we replace the rebellious sons of God, that fail throughout different episodes in the Old Testament, like especially the Deuteronomy 32 worldview, where the nations are allotted to the sons of God, and and we eventually replace them and displace them. So you get this language in Paul, where Paul says, don't you people know that you're going to rule over angels? You're going to judge angels? You can't understand that unless you have a three-tiered divine council structure in your head.
Yeah.
That where the sons of God, which is a hierarchical term, it's not an ontological term, but they have a higher status than angels. Well, if you have the divine council worldview in your head, you're like, boy, that's kind of cool, Paul. Jesus, says, to him that overcomes, I will put them over the nations.
Huh.
Well, who's on top of the nations now? Again, it's the fallen sons of God.
Right.
And Jesus says, look, I'm going to share with you the morning star, which is a messianic term. You're going to rule the nations with a rod of iron, which is the messianic psalm. Jesus quotes a messianic psalm about you. I mean, it's crazy talk. But then again, the context for it is that you are going to participate with me in re-inheriting, reclaiming the nations that God disinherited at Babel and assigned to the lesser sons of God who became corrupt. And of course, they're getting railed against in Psalm 82. But Psalm 82 is just the core of that idea. So your destiny is to rule and reign in a global Eden and to enjoy it forever, and enjoy the prospects of interacting not just with, your deceased uncle or some believer that you always wish you could have met. That's going to be great too, but it takes on again, this sounds like an oxymoron, but sort of an earthly cosmic scale,
Mm-hmm.
to what we're doing and who we are. On my own podcast, we just did an episode on what is the spiritual body Paul talks about. Because when we see the word spirit or we think about it, we think of like wisps of air or light rays or something like that. Well, it's actually language drawn from Ezekiel 1, where the glory has human form.
Mm.
In other words, Ezekiel can see it and knows that it's human form, knows that it's a man. It's like embodied glory. And Paul uses this language to describe the body that we will have. It's things like this that are so easy for us to read over. And again, I don't know where we get this substitute view of heaven that we're just sort of strumming harps, and floating around. It's just a really, really poor substitute, for what's going on.
Yeah, the picture is more of us like having power over creation, even like to the extent of, eventually, like in our resurrected bodies at least, like having the power over what happens on Earth, even being able to control the weather. I don't know, like just crazy stuff. Like think of X-Men times Marvel superheroes times like and beyond. Like just that's and I'm not saying like in this life on Earth, but eventually, and not just powers, but
you're not subject to the limitations of your current embodiment.
Yeah,
it's a different embodiment. It's a glory embodiment.
yes.
It's the embodiment that the enthroned God had in the Old Testament, and the resurrected Christ had in the New. It's still embodiment, but it's a whole lot different.
Yeah, and let me say, following up on that, Jesus did say, "Don't rejoice that the demons are subject to you, but do rejoice that your name is written in the book of life." Mm-hmm. So our primary rejoicing is being one with Him, and is
right, part of the family.
Right. Yeah. Can I read this real quick? There's this really cool passage in C.S. Lewis. He had something called the Space Trilogy. Not everybody's aware of it. But basically what happens is this guy travels, and it's not with, actually in the first one, it's with man-made spacecraft. But in the second one, he goes to what's, Venus, but in this world is called Pure-Landra. And Christ is, his name is Molelville. That's what he's called. It's kind of a mythological, like, overlay. And so what happens is, this, I'll give a little bit of a spoiler. In this book, basically they have the original parents of this race, and they end up not giving way to the fall. They end up passing the test, and they so this is what happens. The Adam figure is called the king, mm-hmm. And the planet, each planet has its own spirit, it's angel, and it's like a governing entity. So it's kind of got some of this, without using the same language, it's got some of these concepts embedded interestingly. And so what he says is the angel Paralandra says that she's supposed to be like Venus. It lies in your bidding toward Oyarsa, said Paralandra, whether I now converse in deep heaven only, or also in that part of deep heaven which is to you a world. It is very much our will, said the king, that you remain with us, for both for the love we bear you, and also that you may strengthen us with counsel, and even with your operations. Not till we have gone many times about our bowl, which is the sun, shall we grow up to the full management of the dominion which Malelville puts into our hands. Nor are we yet ripe to steer the world through heaven, nor to make rain and fair weather upon us. If it seems good to you, remain. I am content, said Paralandra. And it's like, when I read this book, I didn't know about divine council theology, but I was like, this is crazy. Like he's gonna end up like managing the whole planet. And, like,
yeah, I have become convinced. I have a friend too that another scholar, research associate that's really did his dissertation on divine council stuff, more in the New Testament, but he's a real Lewis fan, and he has convinced me, and other things I've run across in literature. And again, this is another. I'll add your thing to the illustration. I'm really convinced that Lewis understood a lot of this stuff, and it's not because he was a biblical scholar. I mean, he'd be the first, like in his Psalms commentary, his Psalms book. He said, "I'm not a biblical." I mean, he's going to admit that. But what he was he was very, very in tune with comparative mythology.
Yeah.
And you see again what this is why I originally wanted to call my book, the marketers won and called it Unseen Realm, but I wanted to call my book originally The Myth That Is True. and I wanted to steal that line from Tolkien, and of course give him credit for it. But these guys could see that the mythology that they knew so well was sort of a pale and in some case perverted mirror imaging or reverse mirror imaging of, again, to quote Tolkien, the myth that was true.
Right.
And again, myth, they knew and understood that myth to an academic means a story in which God and other supernatural beings are major characters. It doesn't mean that this is not true, and so that's why they look at the Gospels and other parts of the Bible, and they'll use words like myth, and what they're talking about is, well, God's the central character in this story. What else would we call it? Again, they view it as literature, but to them it was more. Again, it was the myth that was true, and so they were just tuned to a lot of these these archetypes, these major arcs, the meta narrative that's going on in Scripture, and I'm often impressed, like, wow, they really saw something really clearly here, and it helps me because they have such good imaginations.
Yeah.
That you can start to process what what you're thinking about the way they present it, and I think imagination is the friend of the biblical interpreter, not the enemy.
Right.
Even though a lot of scholars would resist that, they assume you're saying something that you're not saying when you say it.
Yeah.
But yeah, those guys are wonderful, for that.
Yeah, that's the other thing. I won't quote for the sake of time, but if anyone looks at the Iluvatar passage from Tolkien, well, I think there's several passages, but the one I'm thinking of is where he's singing creation into being, and C.S. was actually carried that on with Magician's Nephew, where Aslan sings the world nodding into existence, but he creates the holy ones, and they're just exulting in song and stuff, and I'm like, dude, this is right out of the Bible. Did he make that connection from Scripture, or like?
Well, I've always, I remember reading the stories to my kids and just getting stopped in my tracks one day in the first book. I'm trying to think now. It's not Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe. It's the act in the chronology. I can't remember what it. Maybe it was Magician's Nephew. Yeah. But Jadis, the Ice Queen, is a giant.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
Back in the story, and it's like okay, what's her own heritage, and and he has this sort of divine human sort of mixture thing going on, and he's a giant. And so it really made me, wonder
Wow.
about that. And in the movies, you catch that a few times in some of the scenes where she's just bigger than
Yeah.
the others around her. And it's just another example. Like, man, that can't just be an accident. He wanted to telegraph something that he's tracking on something.
That's
So
so
yeah, it's just great stuff.
cool. Yeah, we could use more of that in popular culture and Christian culture. I can't wait. I think once a lot of this stuff percolates, and hopefully it really will, then we'll get more of that, and will explode. And I think outsiders to the Christian faith will at least just love the imaginative aspect of it and the richness of it, if not be sold on the Christian faith,
Yeah,
and
I
hopefully
mean,
we'll lead them.
I don't have, I have I'm a Lilliputian talent next to these guys, but I'm very sympathetic, to what they were trying to do, piggyback theology on the back of fantasy and fiction. And I try to do that in my own novels, like I have there are theological core ideas that sort of run through the stories, but that's why I do it.
Yeah.
That people who won't pick up a book like Unseen Realm, oh, it's about the Bible, it's one of these Bible books. Well, go read a novel, and hopefully it's adequately, entertaining, and you'll pick up some of these kernel thoughts along the way, and maybe, it'll stimulate some interest there.
Cool. Yeah, I really hope to read your fiction. That's going to be on the top of my list for stuff to read next. So ask him how he thinks that these guys. Uh, Eric's saying that. Ask him how you think maybe Lewis came to these types of conclusions. I think we kind of touched
Well,
on
I'll
it.
just ask you myself if you're gonna do that. I was just curious, like you have this like huge, not only just your own education, but this huge network of scholars and scholarly materials that you can readily access electronically at the touch of a fingertip. And as scholarly as Lewis was, he was a linguist. He was primarily in the English language. He was an author. And he had a lot of friends in high places, and J.R.R. Tolkien, I could say the same, but nowhere near the resources that we have, and this seems to be something that we're just coming across, just really grasping in a way. How is it you think that they really got a hold of it,
Well, I mean, they do live in the early to mid 20th century, and they do have access, to a lot of primary texts that we have today. I mean, they live post-decipherment, things like Egyptian and Akkadian material and whatnot, and even Ugaritic to a little bit of an extent. But I really think that their strength was, again, their deep knowledge of, again, comparative mythology and the way they looked at the Bible as literature. In other words, all of, great literature has the same, sort of meta-narrative themes, archetypal themes, and whatnot. But again, in their parsing, because they were also students of Christian theology, even if they weren't, Greek and Hebrew experts. I know they certainly would have known Latin, probably had a good knowledge of Greek in their training. I think there's a linguistic element. There's just a sense, a real adeptness, a real aptitude for seeing comparative points between bodies of literature and, again, epic stories that, when they come across these things in Scripture, they can see that, okay, a lot of these things are going to be similar because it's not literary borrowing necessarily, because you have, there's a difference geographically once you get out of the ancient Near East, but there still is sort of a common core set of ideas and a kind of shared experiences, from antiquity that survive, from antiquity. I just think they were tuned to all these sorts of things, and they read Scripture as literature. They didn't read it like a textbook. Okay, it wasn't a dry sort of academic exercise to them. They were reading story, and again, supernatural actors as part of the story. And since other literatures do that they were very, again, deeply familiar with, and again, going all the way back into early Christian discussions of a lot of, this medieval material that Lewis was, and Tolkien was so familiar with, that they could readily make connections and discern sort of breadcrumb trails and trajectories. And I think that was really their strength, that they had such a command of meta-narrative and story elements, and they read Scripture that way, and they had the comparative means in their head, again, to make all sorts of connections, and then articulate it in their fiction, to produce their own epics. I think it was a huge advantage to them to be able to do that, and just, again, have such a command of those things. And it really shows, in what, not only what they said about the Bible, but what they produced. That, okay, maybe it's not a complete direct allegory, like Lord of the Rings is not a full allegory to Scripture, but you can tell, they're just tracking on certain themes and theological trajectories all over the place, and they know how to do it because they knew how to read it, in other texts too.
Cool. I want to ask real quick. So we did get started a little late. I don't know if you need to cut off right at 10. Or
No, I'm fine for a little while. Yep.
Okay. So maybe do the full 10 hours, even though we start at 8:15. I mean, 10, did I say 10? I'm sorry, I'm so tired. 2 hours. let's go for 10 hours here. Do a filibuster. Is that okay?
When do you want to go to?
Would 10:15 be okay, or we can cut off right at 10?
Oh, I'm on Pacific time, so my time is 9 o'clock here.
Right. Yeah, I am too. I'm at for another hour, or another hour and 15 minutes.
Well, yeah, that's a little. Let's ask me again when we hit another half hour.
Okay. Okay. I was just wondering because we were going to start inviting additional guests
Sure.
at the top of the hour. But I wanted to ask you another question that has been burning on my heart, because I've always wondered this, and I don't know what insights you have into this, but as far as Abraham and also Melchizedek, it almost seems like, to me, at least when I read the Bible, I got the impression that kind of belief in God, the Most High God, had waned, and so it was almost as if Abraham, and I think some others it's true, Abraham just kind of one day, I actually read this theological commentary one time. It was like, Abraham must have wondered if there was the Most High God above all the other gods, and one day he felt as if God was speaking to him, and I'm just like, was there a tradition passed down to him, or did he just kind of wake up one day and felt God speaking to him, or how did this occur?
Yeah, we're not actually told a whole lot about that. I mean, we are told about the Babel event,
Right.
Where God disinherits the nations, and the story, obviously, it's Babel is set in Mesopotamia. Depending on what you think about Ur of the Chaldees, whether that's a southern location, which is where most people put it, or a northwest Mesopotamian location, which is where I think it is, and I'm not alone there, but it's Mesopotamia anyway. It's part of that disinheritance. This part of the world is part of that disinheritance. So we aren't told how long after the disinheritance, God decides to call Abram. But we know in the biblical story, it's the next major thing, because he disinherits the nations and he turns around and says, I'm going to start over with Abram. So, I mean, we are told that Abram's forefathers were worshippers of other gods, so there has to be a little bit of time in between there. I think that, again, your observation is correct, because if God essentially, again, punishes nations this way and withdraws his own presence from them, then naturally knowledge of him is going to use the word wane. I think that's a good word. You don't have sort of an ongoing, intermittent God injecting himself into the affairs of humanity for ostensibly quite a while, again, as an act of punishment, but it's never completely lost either.
Right.
I mean, you have, even in pantheons, around different parts of the world, everybody has a conception of how the unseen realm works.
Mm-hmm.
And typically that involves simple assumptions like, well, the gods must be intelligent beings. We're intelligent beings, and our society functions much better when there's a leader,
Yeah.
when there's distribution of labor, when somebody, is the one who's giving the orders, and then the other ones are the ones who are taking them. And yeah, you have tension, you have problems, you have friction, you have, all these sorts of things. And so the assumption is that other intelligent beings that are not like us would kind of function the same way. So, there has to be some order, to
Right.
what's going on. Why would intelligent beings not have order? Again, very simple ideas. So they all have a sense of order and hierarchy. The issue is how's the leadership distinguished? Is it one? Is it a small group? Is it a couple? Can the one at the top be toppled? And can it change? That sort of thing. And that's where you start to get into some of the differentiation with how at least Orthodox Israelite thinking would have differed, even from other systems that have, lots of characters, lots of Elohim running around in the spiritual world. It's also, I don't want to rabbit trail too far into this, but it's also why our modern terms aren't quite adequate, to describe what an Orthodox Israelite would have thought. Monotheism doesn't quite cut it, even though the spirit of it is the uniqueness of Yahweh, and that's certainly, consistent. Henotheism doesn't quite work because in a henotheistic system, the top deity can be changed. They can be swapped out. Well, an Orthodox Israelite isn't ever going to say that about Yahweh. That would have been absurd. Polytheism, is more chaotic or disorderly, usually led by a group, a favored group rather than just one. But even then, you got some sense of leadership. Somebody has to be the leader, whether you like him or not. So you have this sensibility, and so when God does, I think it's more than a voice too. Those who have read Unseen Realm will know that God appears, to Abram. That's something God decides to do. Introduces himself and says, "Here's what I'm going to do with you. If you will respond to me, if you will believe that I am who I say I am, and that I intend to be in a covenant relationship with you, because I love you. This is the foundation of our relationship. If you believe that, okay, then." We can have something special here. Essentially, you are Plan B. You are the next installment of getting back to Eden. Of me having a people on earth, a family on earth, and that I will eventually share a rule with. To restore what was lost. That sort of thing. And Abraham has to respond to that. It's not a oh yeah, this happens to me every day. Last week it was this other guy. I mean, there's a real faith decision that has to be made here, and it involves risk, and Abraham makes it. So it's why he is so revered, because this is not an easy thing. It's not a normative thing.
Right. Cool. Yeah. I can already tell we're an hour in, and it's like we're having to paint in broad brushstrokes there. I mean, the level of we can't get into so granular that we cover everything under the sun. So, but I did want to mention the one of the other real big things for me is the presence of Christ in the Old Testament, and I don't know if we want to get guests on asking questions, but so we don't have time to get into all the nuances of it, I guess. But people can look up your stuff on it for sure, and if you want to say a little note about that, you can.
Sure. I spend probably 3 or 4 chapters in Unseen Realm on God as man in the Old Testament.
Yeah.
It's actually was a focus of my dissertation. The short version is, hey, guess what? In Judaism, it used to be perfectly acceptable to talk about a Godhead. Jews referred to it as the 2 powers in heaven. And if people want to get introduced to that idea, they could go to my website, twopowersinheaven.com, and get a little introduction again from a Jewish perspective of how this worked and why Jews thought this way. And it was fine until, again, the 2nd century, which, lo and behold, happens to be the advent of Christianity. What a coincidence. It was fine to talk about that until the second power. You had a bunch of these crazy people called Christians running around saying, hey, we know who that second Yahweh figure, the one that was a man in the Old Testament. Well, we know who that was. He became incarnate in this guy Jesus, and oh, by the way, you just killed him. That was offensive, and that was too much. It was too far to go in the discussion. So there's a lot there in the Old Testament about that has a real great example of something that has a backstory that few Christians realize, is there.
And it's amazing to me. To me, it's like just speaks so much that God wants to be involved with us. He wants to be here with us. He wants to come himself, and not just through intermediaries, like sending intermediaries.
Right.
It's amazing. And it really highlights the love of God to me, to see all that in there.
Mm-hmm.
I think Eric had a question too. Eric?
Oh, I can hold off on mine. I'm doing some behind-the-scenes stuff. You can go on to John.
Oh yeah. Okay, so we have our first guest here.
Yeah, that's actually my Uncle Johnny. He's over in Germany right now, so it's early morning for him, and he's like super into all of that supernatural, like the alternative history, ancient stuff, and just about that in there. So yeah, go on, you guys talk, and I'm out of here.
Can you guys hear me okay?
I can hear another voice, so it must be John.
So no video, just audio?
No, I got video too.
Yeah.
Okay, great. I wrote down a few questions, and then Justin said something that kind of piqued my interest, or a question that I've had for a long time. Have you ever thought about the whole Hammurabi thing, number one? Number two,
I think I missed the first part of that question. There, I got
Abraham.
Go ahead.
Yeah, Abraham, Genesis 14 with Abraham versus Amraphel, who I've read is supposed to be Hammurabi as well. Do you buy into that, number one? Number two, Justin mentioned Melchizedek. Any idea or any ideas on the identity of Melchizedek? I remember reading a book a long time ago where this guy was positing that it could be Shem. Not 100% sure I buy into that or not, but
I don't know how you coherently argue for Shem. That one seems to be in that respect the easier question. I mean, I don't know that we have a really good either reason to say to posit a historical identity for Melchizedek of just swapping in somebody who's more familiar to us.
Yeah.
I don't think that there's really any reason to have to do that. But even if there was, I don't think we have a really good candidate. The interesting thing is that even if Melchizedek was not some sort of divine being, I think in the Old Testament he's portrayed as a normal guy. Nothing terribly unusual about him. In the intertestamental period is when you start to get some of this material accrue to him about kind of a divinity figure. And even in the Dead Sea Scrolls, there's a scroll called 11Q Melchizedek, which is really interesting because it quotes Psalm 82. And it has Melchizedek being the Elohim, the leader of the council, in Psalm 82, in that text. In other words, Melchizedek becomes sort of the interpretive filter for Psalm 82 in that Dead Sea Scroll text. And so what it tells you is that there are people looking at Melchizedek, again, as I'll say it this way, as a second Yahweh figure. Because you get Yahweh, again, as a man in the Old Testament. You have, in the unseen realm, I talk about the two Yahwehs of the Old Testament, one visible, the other invisible. They're the same, but yet they're different. Same way that early Christians and modern Christians talk about Jesus. Jesus is but isn't God. Well, he's God, but he's not the Father. So you got this is but isn't thing going on, and that was very common talk in Judaism. Who's the second Yahweh guy? The one that appears embodied as a man. And so by the time of the Second Temple period, Melchizedek becomes a candidate for that because again he has this different priesthood. He has this special relationship with Abraham. Again, people are pulling stuff out of the Old Testament narrative that seems to indicate he's a little different, and so he gets this status. So on the one hand, that isn't a denial that he's not just a man, but he could be more than a man if you follow the thinking there, because even angels are described this way in the Old Testament. They're described as men, in Genesis 19, but they're more than that. But why are they described that way? Well, that's what they look like, So, it opens the door, for lots of speculation. But I don't think there's I've not seen a really good case that I've read that's like, yeah, okay, this guy nailed this down, or she just really, put the nail on the head there, and we don't have to think about this anymore. So I haven't come across anything like that. I don't really buy into to the Hammurabi thing. It's a little more possible than the Shem thing. It would depend on, the easy answer, the evasive answer is to say, well, the chronology might not work right, but I'm a bit jaded when it comes to Old Testament chronology. I used to be really into chronology, and then I was driven to the pit of despair.
Yeah, I'm still.
There's just a lot of problems, to encounter in trying to figure out the chronological systems. So I'll entertain that one, but I can't say I'm camped out there.
Yeah. And I mean, I'm not 100% convinced either way. I tend to think that if we could identify him as someone else in the Bible, it might be Job. I think Job fits it time-wise, age-wise, characteristics, things like that. But I mean, again, it's nothing I don't think you could prove.
Yeah,
either way.
Yeah, I don't know how you'd build a compelling case, in any one direction, as opposed to a circumstantial one.
Yeah, completely. And then the angels and all that. You're just bringing up more and more things to ask, but I'll kind of stay off of that. But what about the Amraphel Hammurabi thing? Have you ever heard much about that, or do you know much about that?
Yeah,
what do you think about that?
I have not. I've not heard much about that at all, so I can't really comment. If you have something good to send me on that, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, maybe I'll Google it and try to find something. Again, I just remember reading a long time ago that Amraphel was supposed to be, it really was supposed to be Hammurabi, something like that, and modern day kind of anti-biblical historians never seem to mention that he's mentioned in the Bible,
Mm-hmm.
Also heard much about the pyramids, the Great Pyramids at Giza, kind of representing Orion's belt. And if so, and if you buy into that, what do you think that has to do with Nimrod, Osiris, Apollo, the great god of way back when? Is there some kind of connection there? Do you see that?
I like archaeoastronomy. There's certainly a lot to it. The problem with Orion's belt, again, something Hancock won't necessarily tell you, is that for his reconstruction and Bauval's reconstruction for it to work, they have to they have to do a reverse mirror image of the pyramids with Orion's belt. In other words, the angle's tilted the opposite way, even though in terms of degree it's going to align pretty closely. But for their whole system to work, it's actually a mirror opposite, as opposed to, again, being like a replica. So that mars some of the things that they try to argue in their reconstruction. But just just in general, the notion of building objects on Earth that map themselves, to constellations and things like that. That's ubiquitous. I mean, you can find that all over the world, and I don't think it necessarily argues, for specific times and specific places, because there are other things that have to. You can't just take one object, and even one complex, like 3 or 4 objects. What you really need is you need a correlation, kind of a snapshot of a very wide, kind of region. So that then you would know, based upon, positioning, when this could have been done as opposed to when it certainly could not have been done. So I like the field. I think it's a serious field. There are certainly serious people in it. I mean, when I say serious, I mean scholar types, scientists and whatnot. This is not a field that people should dismiss. There's a lot in the scholarly literature on it, just an awful lot. But I think, again, with like Hancock and Bivol, I think they get a little bit lost, trying to use that to. It's kind of like taking Plato's line about Atlantis, and now we have 6 volumes on it, what Atlantis was like. All these things that accrue to it. That's
or another History Channel show.
I know. That's a little bit of the way I kind of look at what's going on there with Hancock and Bivol, that they've taken, they've seized upon an important observation, but yet it gets extrapolated so widely, and the wider you go, the more speculative it becomes, and which is unfortunate, because then it's easier for people to pick at, and then kind of argue that the whole thing is not worth looking at, and I don't believe that either. I think it's a bit of an overstating the case sort of situation.
I got one more question, but I don't want to kind of monopolize the time. I know the other guys wanted to ask something as well, but if it's okay, I want to ask one more question. Hopefully it won't open up a can of worms.
We like worms.
This is a good one, though. This will get people doing their regular internet cussing and all this good stuff. So, premillennialism, replacement theology, etc. I really like your approach to these things, that you can't really fit someone into a system, or I think all too often maybe we try to fit ourselves into a system and identify with that. I'm premillennialist, I'm postmillennialist, etc. So I really like your approach to that. Forget about the titles and the systems, and let's just try to find out what the Bible says. In light of that, I've watched a couple of your interviews where it's obvious that Gentile Christians saved are grafted in, and we're called the Israel of God, or Jews and things like this in the New Testament. And then the question of the Jews, the physical Jews, and the land promises to Abraham being fulfilled, I almost think that that's a little bit moot, or the later prophecies in the Old Testament books, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Zechariah, etc., etc. So, if that's a little disjointed, I apologize. But my question is, in light of that, Christians being grafted in, whether or not the land promises are fulfilled, what about the prophecies throughout the Old Testament, Isaiah through Zechariah, that really kind of clearly show that Jews will go back in their land in the latter days? To fit all this together, I can't really do it, and I think it's kind of maybe beyond our understanding at this time. But what do you think about that? I mean, the prophecies really seem to be clear.
Yeah,
Jews going back to their land.
Yeah, especially if, again, let's for the sake of the conversation assume the lateness, of the second half of Isaiah and the lateness of the second half of Zechariah, because if those are post-exile, post-exile and post-return, then you naturally have this question of, well, we can't really look at these passages and presume that the fulfillment of these passages was in fact the return from exile. And there's a lot that argues against that anyway, because if you go to Ezekiel 36, Ezekiel 37, when there's a return described, it's always all the tribes, not just two. Okay, so the 10 tribes that were scattered to the wind, in the northern captivity, what about them? Because the ones that return, for sure, are just essentially Judah and Benjamin. We could assume that Benjamin's there. But what about the rest of the tribes? And so you get this 10 lost tribes thing going on. I mean, that all of that is presumed in Jesus' time too. There are a number of indications that Jesus spoke to them as though they were still in exile, and frankly they were, because of, again, these missing tribes. So then the question shifts. Then the question becomes, well, these passages about the return to the land, why can't those be fulfilled at Pentecost and thereafter? In other words, all of these Jews scattered all over the nations, and if we read the book of Acts, closely, Samaria is mentioned. Again, there are regions mentioned to which northern tribes, at least in Old Testament times, would have wound up. In other words, it's not just all the focus of Judah and Benjamin in Babylon and Persia. So why can't we look at Pentecost and say that this event is the fulfillment of this regathering? In other words, they come back to the land to celebrate Pentecost. They hear the message about the Messiah. They believe it, and then they take it back to the nations that need to be reclaimed because of what happened, Deuteronomy 32:8-9, what happened at Babel. Isn't this a sufficient reason to conclude that the Jews, all the tribes, have now embraced the Messiah, even though it's not every single Jew, that who's ever lived, and every single Jew that lived thereafter, but you have representatives of all 12 tribes embracing the Messiah, being brought back into God's family, grafted back in, so as it were, along with the Gentiles, and there we go. It's sort of the beginning of the happy ending, where it's Jew and Gentile, every tribe, and every nation, people being extracted, from the enslavement to other gods, brought back into relationship with the true God, the God of Israel. Well, I think you can build a good case for that. The question for me is there any way to look at that and think, okay, conclusively that's all there is to it? And that's the part where I say, I don't know, because that dovetails into the question, okay, Paul's very clear in Galatians and a few places in Romans that, hey, someone's really a Jew not because they're circumcised or not because of their birth. They're a Jew because they believe like Abraham believed, and that includes the Gentiles. And so you get this redefining of Israel and redefining of the word Jew. But the question becomes, okay, everywhere Paul and other New Testament writers talk about Jews and Israel, when they're talking about eschatology, are we saying that they never mean, physical, political, geographical Israel? And I don't know that you can say that. I think that Scripture is actually ambiguous on that point. So I think you can make a good case, for these passages about a return to the land being fulfilled at Pentecost. But what I don't think you can say is that you're sure that that's all there is to it. And that's where, again, my hermeneutic, if you want to call it that, is that I think prophecy is deliberately cryptic. I think it was deliberately cryptic the first time. I think it could only be known in hindsight, and I don't see any reason to conclude why it won't work the same way the second time around. And so I'm content to live with the ambiguity. I know the systems, they're all beautiful when you don't look at the other ones. I get that, I understand it, but there are outliers to all the systems, and I think that's by design. So again, when I'm content to hit the wall and say, I don't know, it could be either. I don't feel like I have to be married to any of the views.
And to be fair to that,
Okay, thanks.
I'm sorry, was someone's trying to talk? When the just before Jesus came, and while he was there, the Jews had all these different interpretations of messianic prophecies and how God was going to restore Israel. And I've read a little bit. I haven't fully read this book, It's Right, How Jesus Became King, but he goes into how they interpreted some of these passages two different ways, and to them they were mutually contradictory. Like God would, I'm trying to remember the two different ways. I think one was like God would suffer on their behalf or something like that, and the other one was anyway. I'm sorry, but there were different theories, and they seem to contradict, but Jesus blended all of them into one whole, and in some way that they couldn't imagine. He makes the same point about eschatology. How, in hindsight, they'll be like, "Oh, yeah, of course, it makes sense now."
Well, you look at what goes on in the Gospels. After the resurrection, Jesus is standing there in the upper room. I mean, they're looking at the resurrected Christ, and the text says he had to open their minds to understand. Like, they still don't get it. And it's easy for us to kind of poke at them and think, boy, you guys really, one brick short of a load here. It's easy for us to look at it that way, but the reality is, and again, I've said on shows and in front of live audiences, which might be a little dangerous, things like, hey, do you realize that there is no verse in the Old Testament that talks about a dying, rising Messiah, who would die for your sins and be God incarnate? Yeah. There's no verse like that, and people, they look like they're going to freak out, and it's like, well, folks, the reason that there's no verse like that is because all of those things are there, but they're just scattered. The messianic profile is scattered in a dozen places. And again, I think that's deliberate because of what Paul said in 1 Corinthians 2. Had the rulers of this world known, they would have never done this. They're not morons.
Mystery for the ages.
Yeah, and so they can only know it in hindsight. So yeah, even though the resurrected Christ is standing in front of them, like, well, here's where it all ends, guys. This Messiah stuff. Here we are. They still don't get it because they haven't had enough time to look back. And again, just sort of, okay, now with hindsight, let's reread our Old Testament. And it's like, duh. I mean, of course. I remember, when Jesus said this or quoted that when we were here and doing this, and now it just sort of falls into place.
Right.
And I think, again, there were things they could have known, little bits, but they could not see the mosaic. And I think that's the way it's going to be for us. Anyone, again, living, now and in the future, we're not going to know how all this works until we look back and then we see it. So this is why I blog things like, an obsession with eschatology is a waste of time. And people get angry, on my blog, when I say that. Well, I'm not saying don't ever study eschatology. I'm just saying, like, there are other things to study too. Like don't devote your life to this. Like some people devote their life to who wrote the book of Hebrews. Have you ever seen the movie about the little kid? I think it's Waiting for Bobby Fischer. It's the story of Josh Waitskin, who became like a grandmaster as a kid. There's this scene in there where he's at a chess club, and they're trying to take him to the next level of being great, to like being master material. And this guy runs up to the instructor and says, "I did it! I captured a pawn." Like, okay, dude. like you've been here for months and you've captured a pawn, but it's like they just obsess over this little achievement, this little thing, and this is a nut you're not going to be able to crack.
I am so glad that you said that. I love that you just said that because I was just burning in my mind. I wanted to ask you, speaking of guys who think they've cracked a nut and have something to say about it, why you hate Zachariah Sitchin so much?
I have heard really, if you want an example of somebody who really doesn't like Sitchin, you don't come to me. There are people out there still, and I'm not going to drop any names here because they'll.
You've been exceptionally gracious. I've heard you speak about them before.
I have heard I have heard from people that have really big names on this ancient astronaut UFO circuit, let's just put it that way, who have, I mean, I've even had them call me. Sitchin was a disinformation agent working for the Illuminati, and, he was planted, to put this narrative out in the pop culture, and it's because of this and this and this. It's like, look,
Wow.
I appreciate, that you wanted to unload on me with this thought, but I think the guy just, kind of believed what he wrote, and he wanted to make some money. He wanted to make a living out of it, and he did just fine. So I'm not buying it, but I'm not really an agent of the Illuminati. Like, come on, just
Him and Eric Von Daniken are the only reasons why I haven't written a book yet.
see now, Sitchin, I think has a more honorable reputation than Von Daniken. I mean, Von Daniken is just kind of a shady dude,
Oh yeah, I read him when I was in like a teenager, and I was all taken in by that.
I've had a thought about this, and I want to ask Dr. Heiser what he thinks about this. Are you familiar at all with our quantum idealism movement?
No.
This is our resident genius, Johanna, and he's a quantum physicist undergraduate at Biola.
Postgrad, no, Biola. Moreland told me.
Yeah.
But I was thinking, and I noticed this. You see a lot of the times people think of angels and demons and so on as being spiritual entities, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so they're non-corporeal and so on. But when you look at what the Bible says and look at even the Apocrypha and so on, they have like a physical form. They have a actual shape. They can touch things and so on.
Mm-hmm.
And I realized that beforehand most Christians are operating from this dualistic paradigm, right? Where there's matter and energy on the one side, that's the natural world, and then there's spirit and ideas and so on. That's another side, that's the mental world, the supernatural world, and those two are disparate. And angels and demons are off in the supernatural world, and what we think of as aliens are in the natural world, right?
Right.
If you operate on an idealist paradigm, you have a situation where natural and supernatural blur together. The natural is a simulation within the supernatural. Now you could say additionally, well, okay, so the angels and the demons are outside the simulation. There's still a kind of duality there, and in a sense that's true. But at the same time, they also manifest as physical beings with at least in the sense that they can interact and so on.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering if maybe to some extent, what these, I mean, not to say that they would necessarily be aliens in that sense, maybe they could be, maybe not, but would it be conceivable that the whole dichotomy between supernatural beings and aliens might be false insofar? The atheists take the converse, like there are some atheists who will believe in ancient alien type theories, and they'll say, well, all these gods are actually just aliens.
Mm-hmm.
There's no such thing as real gods or demons or angels.
Yeah, I kind of think that our vocabulary just really isn't adequate. Granted, part of it is how you're defining certain ideas. For instance, if you're going to define an extraterrestrial as a biological life form that's subject, to the laws of physics as we know them, that has to eat, has to hydrate, has to reproduce its species, hates its job, all this kind of stuff. If you're going to define it like that, well, angels aren't ever described like that. But if you're going to step back and then start talking about some of the things you're talking about, then you can go and ask a question like, well, isn't there really only one eternal, uncreated being in normative Christian theology, and that would be God? And if that's the case, and we are creationist, or we are dualist in the sense of the creation.
Creator versus creation, right?
Right. If that's the case, then everything else that we assign to the spiritual world has to be made of something. Okay, and then from that you go on to like Paul, talking about the spiritual body. Well, for the ancients, the gods were made of something. Their flesh wasn't like our flesh. Their blood, it wasn't, ichor wasn't like our blood, but they were still made of something. They still had corporeality, but it was different than our corporeality. And they were gods and we weren't, and they couldn't really die. They sort of died, but then they didn't really die. You get all these distinctions and these gradations, but they are nevertheless material in some sense. So, I mean, when you start asking questions like this, the vocabulary like supernatural and natural,
It all starts
and
to disintegrate.
yeah, and even material and immaterial, it
But
might
I've done
be a
this
little bit.
before. I
Yeah.
kind of trolled an atheist once with this, right? And I have some arguments that are very powerful with idealism. Like I've gotten
Yeah.
full-blown scientific materialists to believe in Berkeley and idealism in a matter of 15 minutes with physics, and it's crazy. But then they have to go on to, how do you get into Christianity? And I did this troll one time. This is kind of a troll joke on someone once, and I was drawing parallels. But I broke down the whole notion of angels and demons being versus aliens being like a false dichotomy.
Mm-hmm.
And I then brought in parallels between the serpent in Genesis and David Icke's reptilians, and very quickly he was believing in literal talking snakes.
Mm-hmm.
Only, of course, they came in flying saucers and the whole 9 yards. But
Yeah.
it was hilarious because this was a hardcore atheist, and it was,
No,
he was all like, "Oh my goodness!" And next thing you know,
Well,
he's got
and
this
that-
funny. It's Christianity, but it looks like science fiction.
yeah, boy,
Speaking of which, how about that Nakash?
that's even worse than just sort of how did I want to say this? Oh, the thought escapes me now, but yeah, I mean, I know what you're doing. It's I know what I was going to say. That's even worse than people who sort of will want to be atheists, and then they gravitate toward the ancient astronaut thing just because they hate Darwin, or they don't they don't like something with Darwinism,
Well, I got him to believe in, and then I suggested, here's another thing a lot of people don't think about with aliens, with the Fermi paradox, is, the age of the universe. I mean, I'm guessing you're not a young Earth creationist, and especially not a young universe creationist or anything like that. I did create the universe. My big thing is what I think anyway, and then it's substantially older than we think. Than the
yeah,
other
I'm not offended by any of that. So
okay, that's good. So, issue then is, our species is relatively young, and we live in a pretty old universe, and we think that we see aliens, it's going to look like Star Trek. 400 years in the future, we got our warp drive spaceships and so on, and except you got, instead of 400 years in the future, you've got races that could be 400,000 years in the future or 400 million years in the future. They're going to see Star Trek like the Stone Age, and you think, what would that look like? And I pointed out, this is actually kind of an interesting thing. They're discovering now that what they call space-time is emergent, which is kind of very dangerous. It really destroys physicalism in a way, because it says, the whole, space-time is the ground of physicality, and if you take that away, it becomes everything is merged and not physical. But
if you don't have that,
yeah, what I was pointing out to them is, with some of this physics, if you had races that are millions of years, thousands of millions of years more advanced than us, they could manipulate what's going on behind space-time and even pull themselves off into that non-spatial realm. And for all intents and purposes, if you ran into a being like that, it'd probably be more like the Q on Star Trek or the Ascended beings on Stargate. But if you ran into a being like that, if you saw that, you would not think alien on top of your head, would you? That just wouldn't come to mind. You interact with a being like that, and what would you think?
Yeah, the other thing
Angel or
too.
demon.
The other thing that's part of this discussion is, okay, a lot of people will. Let's go back to the whole the angel and alien thing. So again, if what we're thinking about an extraterrestrial is the way I described, well, then there is this pretty clear disconnect between, at least potentially, between the way angels are described and the way aliens are described. But if you drift off into the other dimensions, possibility or category, well, then you have to ask yourself questions like, okay, if there are these other dimensions, do they have different physical laws? Are there different limitations? Is materiality something different than our material? In other words, you have these different dimensional places, and the assumption is that allows us to talk about angels and aliens the same way. They're just from different dimensions, and so then they could be the same. But you have to actually ask these questions about, okay, well, if these other dimensions are out there, is it really the same? It could be quite different still, and so that creates a disconnect, you know.
Well, I
So
do have in particular, we do have some idea now as to what spacetime emerges from, and it's entanglements which are described mathematically by Hilbert space. So it is basically okay, and it is a kind of a crazy little trick, and this kind of spooks people out when I tell them this, but yeah, they call this quantum cognition. They found that your
yeah,
thoughts in your mind behave like the quantum wave function. Yeah, like you have your favorite ice cream, and you may pick chocolate or strawberry or vanilla or mint or whatever, and you're not gonna necessarily pick it right off the bat. You might waver for a bit, right? You can't,
mhm.
as opposed to Bayesian logic where you just finally go to your result and there you are. So the point is that with this, they're finding that the mind behaves like, their thoughts behave like quantum wave functions. And furthermore, they're finding that what spacetime emerges from is entanglement, which is defined by the quantum wave function. And so you can define what's going on beneath spacetime as, in a sense, mental. And so it's kind of cool because you can have.
There's a difference between saying one thing behaves like another and one thing is.
I know what you mean. I know what you mean. The catch of that is, and this is a technical detail, but it's something called the Feynman universal simulator problem, where they showed that if something behaves quantum in superposition, it'll necessarily have to be quantum as well, or else the entire system will slow down exponentially. Because you have your chocolate and vanilla simultaneously in superposition in a quantum state, and now you want to put that onto a classical bit. Beforehand you have a qubit, and the qubit or quantum bit stacks both states in at once, right? When you put that into a classical bit, now it's unpacked into 2 bits. It's not 1 bit anymore, it's 2 bits, and you have to keep doing this with all the bits. Okay, so all of a sudden your hard drive space is going to expand exponentially, and then likewise the processing power. Am I going?
Let me, if I can.
No,
I derailed the conversation.
Well, no, I think I like
Where
this.
are we?
This is why we're starting another podcast called Paranormal.
Ooh.
Which PEER, Paranormal, because there's actually a lot of peer-reviewed literature on the whole panoply of topics that we would associate with being paranormal, and a lot of it drifts off into these areas. And
right.
The purpose of that podcast is to introduce people to the fact that, hey, there are real scientists out there in real labs doing real research on these things, and you need to be aware of them instead of going to Billy Bob's website.
I mean, I've seen what was it? The Global Consciousness Project had something like a 8.22. They broke 8.225 sigma with their test, which is the cutoff for something being accepted in science is 5 sigma, but they're just kind of ignored because that implies something very spooky and anti-materialist about the nature of consciousness, and we can't have that in academia because, well,
Hey, just become a solipsist like me. That solves everything.
Yeah, that'll give religion bullets, and we can't have that. And only crazy people believe in that sort of thing. And so,
Well, I don't know if I want to sum up. I wanted to kind of give a layman's version of what he said, but then I fear that will open another can of worms.
That was the layman's version.
We may do a follow-up video on explaining kind of what he was going at with that, for those who didn't completely follow, because I know what he was trying to say. But I wanted to say something about the stitching thing, and I kind of wanted to eventually tell you this, Mike, because this is when I first was introduced to you, and it was kind of amazing that you're talking about how stitching. Probably just kind of like bumbling along, didn't really know what he was doing. I think that may be true, but regardless, he did seem to be, to me, used by the enemy, because as flimsy as the ideas are, it's amazing how the enemy can deceive people, and with just such narratives with such holes in them, but people don't really check up on a lot of this stuff. And I think it was like 2010. I was in art history class, and we were going our first day or so. We were going over the Sumerian text, the Epic of Gilgamesh, and so we were like going through all that. Like I'd never read it book close. I knew that there were some parallels, like there were some similarities at least, however distant to the Hebrew Bible. But so there was all these different angles. There was that. There was the fact that uh, I was coming across these videos that were talking about the whole Stitching thing, like the Planet X and the how these alien beings were in the Sumerian text, and they talked about them coming down from heaven. And I wasn't really checking up on. I wasn't doing my research or anything like that. I just kind of was like, "Well, this guy's a scholar, like what?" And I was real strong in my faith, but at the same time, it was starting to get really weird because I got that, and like I was reading up online about it, and how like there are couple different names for God given in the Old Testament, and each one was actually originally representing a different entity, like Enlil versus Enki, and they were doing different things, and it kind of like it made this imaginative story where it showed the break in the narrative, like this imaginary break in the narratives where they were each doing different things and they were in conflict and stuff like that, and and at the same time, like these videos were saying that like humans had not just evolved from apes because our like different our genes have been spliced or meshed together to create us, and that the ancient aliens did this, and and it was just like all this stuff coming at once. It was so weird how coincidental.
They have a copyright on us, in fact.
What?
They have copyright too.
Exactly. Yeah, we were made for them. To be their slaves and stuff. And so I knew enough to know that there must be a being that from which none greater can be conceived. But at the same time, I was like, well, I identified this being with the God of the Bible, and like, but then they're like kind of sharding this in front of my face, and I'm like, what the heck is going on here? And I started to get like almost despairing, like I don't understand. Like this is the weird, and it was the stupidest thing. In hindsight, it was just the stupidest thing. But at the time, it was really like distressing me. And so in the midst of that, I remember this specific afternoon, I was looking this stuff up and I was praying. I was like, God, if you are the true God, show me, please help me like figure this out. And I went to go make toast or something. I came back, and the next Google search I did, all of a sudden I came to this website, SitchinIsWrong.com. I was like, wow, that's bold. I clicked on it, and then I saw all this rigorous stuff. Like, if you actually check the text and stuff like that, and you'll see that he's just like this, all this stuff is just made up out of thin air. And I was like, wow. And then like you were even talking about the flood, how it was like more out of all the flood myths of the ancient world, it was the most meteorological, astronomically correct, and stuff like that. And I was like, dude, who is this guy? I started looking up your name and everything. That's after that.
Yeah, who is this? Who is this crazy man? Yeah.
I've been like an addict ever since. Every video I can find of yours,
Got some kind of interference in here.
Yeah, I just want to take advantage of this awesome interference to just levy one more serious question. Break up the static. I was just wondering, because I've had a lot of thoughts about this lately. I've always seen a distinction between demons and fallen angels in Scripture, and maybe that's a false dichotomy in my own mind that's prejudiced by what I've heard from a lot of other people with ideas, especially.
Mention something about that.
Well, give me a second. Give me just.
My bad.
Okay.
Sorry.
Okay. So anyway, I was just curious. It's like I've been thinking a lot. What if what we see as demons, and how the Bible describes it, thinking through the mindset of that first century Israelite, what if we're really talking about psychological complexities that have been given a personification through the idiomatic language of how they communicate? Maybe, I mean, it doesn't need to be like, well, there aren't supernatural agents. Well, of course, I see fallen angels doing things all over the place. But there's something about the demonic activity, even the way people characterize it nowadays. I mean, I don't mind calling him a whack job, John Hagee. You get guys like him. I've read like a couple of his books, and it's like obviously this guy's keying in on something in the collective psyche that we all want to really just gravitate towards, and it's just stupid. It's obviously stupid. But I don't know. I guess I'll just leave it at that. I'm just really trying to work through this and
You
figure
may
it out.
you may have just solved your own mystery there. I mean,
So you think demonic activity can be largely explained psychologically?
well, I certainly think there are demonic entities. There are passages in the Gospels. Some of them associate demonic activity with I guess what we could call physical or psychological maladies, and you will get healing vocabulary in some of these deliverance accounts. So if that's all you had, you'd have actually the ability to make a better case for that. But you actually have both, which is a roundabout way of saying, yeah, in some passages you could have that, again, what you're suggesting, but you can't have it in all of them. So there's probably, kind of like 6 of one and half a dozen of another, depending on what the episode is. So, but you astutely point out that, or I should say, imply that the non-materialists, in the academy, will use the healing language to say it's only that, and therefore we can deny again, a spiritual world or something like that. So, you run into those people, but that can very easily just be filed under selective use of evidence. Unfortunately, scholars do that too because they don't like, a non-material reality. But yeah, I think it just depends on the episode, as to the wideness of that net.
It seems really hard to see a purely naturalistic explanation behind the Legion incident.
Sure.
And there's other things like that. But there's also that time where the guy's just like cutting himself and going all crazy and everything, and it's just like Jesus speaks peace to him.
Yeah. So now we can conclude that pigs have the same mental faculties and mental disturbances as humans do.
Liberal logic 101.
Yeah. Well, yeah. There you go. Well, that was added. That was added later. Let's whip out the old redaction. Thing.
Oh my goodness. And on a side note, there are some sects of Islam in the Middle East that teach that Jews are the product of apes and pigs.
Sure.
Had to throw that out there for everyone. Do with it what you will.
I do have some questions from people who weren't able to actually join, so I want to see if I can try to get some kind of run through them.
Going back to to Sitchin again, I think for those who might be listening or that aren't as familiar with me, my big beef with Sitchin is his abuse of texts. Whether they're biblical. Is my audio coming through?
Yeah, it is.
Okay.
I can hear you fine. I can barely hear Justin.
Okay, yeah, all right. I saw your note, and I was wondering if it was me or Justin. But yeah, my big beef with him is just what he does with texts, and I just think it's really unfair to the ancient person who's trying to communicate something for you to just impose a 21st century sci-fi technological narrative over what this person's trying to communicate, especially when there's such obvious things like, hey, we've got a lot of cuneiform astronomical texts. Guess what? There's no planet mentioned in any of them beyond Saturn. Nibiru was never a planet, beyond Saturn. It doesn't cycle through every 3,600 years. There is no text that has the Anunnaki associated with Nibiru. I mean, so people misunderstand it and think, oh, you're just quibbling about your translation versus Sitchin's. No, actually, I'm not. I can't argue about the translation of something that doesn't exist. It's much more fundamental than that, which is why I made the boring video on SitchinIsWrong.com. Mike going up to the internet. We're here at the electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature. Let's type in Anunnaki. Hit the button. You try to get people to go up there and do the search. Just do the search. and then hit the little TR button for translation and check up on me. I know you'll be checking up on Sitchin when you do it, but check up on me. If this was so easy, to overturn what I'm saying, I wouldn't be saying it any longer. But it's still offensive to a lot of people because this has become their faith.
Well, the thing is they've come across a guy who has the same epistemology as them. I think is what it really comes down to, the same depth.
Yeah.
And you come across to maybe some of them as an elitist. Would that be fair?
I think that's probably fair, even though I'm actually very anti-elitist, but to someone again who isn't part of academia, yeah, I think that's fair. That people could still draw that conclusion.
Mm-hmm.
In various subcultures like this resistance against scholarship because, to be fair, there is always a scholarship who shut down questions and shut down like inquiry, like weird questions and stuff like that. Not, and I wouldn't say that on a broad scale, but there are.
I can't really hear your audio. Yeah.
Okay, well, I'll just let other people.
I'll just go on and ask that question. I had looked down through the questions that Justin had just sent me, and the one that jumped out to me, funny enough, was the first one on the list. And I think I know where the person's going that asked it. Oftentimes, it's leveled the accusation against God, the genocide of Canaan when the Israelites came into it. And there's certain people that justify that through there being like half-bred humans and Nephilim and whatnot. Going back to Genesis 6, I mean, can we say definitively that was angels interbreeding with humans? Can we say that was perhaps sons of God, the Banai Elohim, literally coming down and procreating with humans? And if so, how could they have a line after the flood, which was supposedly intended to wipe them out?
Yeah, I spend 5 chapters in this on the book.
I really did intend to read it beforehand. I've just been so bogged down. I'm sorry.
Well, I actually bring up there are 2 what I would call supernatural views of this. I mean, the one is the face value reading is what you just described. You have a sexual cohabitation. That gets linked, specifically, after the flood in Numbers 13 with the Anakim, and they get linked to the Rephaim, and that, they're all over the land when the conquest, starts to happen. So, that's one possibility. The other possibility, again, for a supernatural approach to this, is to assume that, well, we have these episodes, like with Abraham and Sarah, where there's no sexual language there, but Sarah is enabled to have a child through some sort of divine intervention. We're not really told what it is. And so maybe the language of Genesis 6 is euphemistic for this kind of thing happening. In other words, you have rival gods, sons of God, that as part of their rebellion want to raise up their own peoples, their own populations, who will be direct combatants, direct opposition to the Israelites, to Yahweh's own children, that he's going to raise up through Abraham and Sarah. So it's sort of a reading the narrative, the earlier narrative against what happens later, trying to go with that, retain the supernatural flavor of it, but without a direct, sexual cohabitation, because you don't get that, with Abraham and Sarah. So I talk about both of those possibilities in the book, but either of them, when you get to the conquest, I think what people need to realize about the conquest is it's not actually cast as some sort of indiscriminate genocide. There are lots of verbs, for what the Israelites are supposed to do and what they do in the conquest, and not all of them involve killing. There's drive out, there's expel, there's dispossess, disinherit, these sorts of things. So, that's part of what happens. It's not just go in and kill everyone. And in the book, what I do is, and I had a follow-up blog post to this, I don't know, maybe 3-4 weeks ago, maybe a month ago, where if you look at karem, this part's in the book. If you look up karem, which is the Hebrew term to devote to destruction, the main sort of killing verb, where that verb is actually used, you sort of the conquest gets introduced by it in one general statement, and then these other verbs are also used of the conquest, the ones that are not killing. And then when you actually get into the conquest narratives, where harem is used, it happens to be used in the places where Anakim have been spotted or described in other passages, the hill country. All of the harem incidences happen in the hill country. The other verbs for killing, okay, avad, to destroy or something like that, guess what? They also overlap with the hill country. So at the end of the conquest, Joshua defines victory with this statement: there are no more Anakim in the land. The ones that are left, have fled to the Philistine cities, and of course that's where you run into them later with Goliath. So what I think is going on here is we need to read the conquest narrative against this idea that, we are Yahweh's people, and there are other people here among the inhabitants of the land that were raised up by rival gods, rival spiritual forces. However we want to look at that, whether it's cohabitation, who am I to say that gods can't do X, Y, or Z, that kind of thing, or the language is used to just convey the idea that these certain bloodlines, these certain populations, were raised up supernaturally by rival gods who hate Yahweh and His people and want to eliminate. This is how an Israelite would have read the conquest narrative. That's my argument. He would not have read it as indiscriminate genocide. He would have read it that yes, we need to drive these people out, but there are people scattered among, the masses of the land that do need to be eliminated because this is their origin point. This is what the Israelites would have believed about those particular bloodlines, the Anakim, the Rephaim, that sort of thing. And they get linked, back to the Nephilim, so that when I talk about the question about, well, how do you get them after the flood? And they're basically three views. I'll give you the quick version here. View number one, and all of these you can find, in ancient texts somewhere, hints of them. Some of them are more explicit than others, but view number one is that Noah's children, or specifically, his grandchildren, through the wives of his sons, were carriers essentially. And so you get, texts that speculate about, whether their children were offspring of the Watchers. You even get one text, the Genesis Apocryphon, that actually wonders this about Noah himself, where Noah's father Lamech has a conversation with his mom, whose name is Bitanosh, in the Genesis Apocryphon. He
looks white, and they thought he's a Watcher's kid, right?
Yeah, he's like, hey, are you sure? Don't lie to me. Is my kid one of the Watchers? And she's like, well, don't you remember the other night? Like, come on, So they have this argument, but it tells you that Jewish writers are asking the same questions, and this is the option, at least for one of these, and his mom denies it and all that stuff. You have another text that has Noah as a giant. I mean, there is a text from in early Jewish stuff that shows again that this is on the table for some Jews. Now, view number two would be that the flood was not a global event, a truly global event, even though the language of the nations, Genesis 10, that's the world they knew. So even if you have a regional event, to them that would have been the whole world. I get that, but you'd have a regional event for the flood instead of a truly global event. And so therefore, you could have some of these people survive. And you say, well, where in the world would you get that from the Old Testament? Well, it really stems from the references to the Philistines as descendants from Caphtor. Caphtor, again, is Crete. It's this Aegean area. And the Philistines are archaeologically known as descendants or members of the sea peoples. They were seafaring peoples. And so people look at that and say, well, maybe we have a regional event and some of these seafaring peoples managed to survive, and that's why we get, the Nephilim, the Rephaim later. Because you get Philistines in Canaan, according to biblical history, before you get migrations of sea peoples, in wider texts like Egyptian texts. So maybe some of the early vestiges of this. So people try to construct a view that way. The third option is that in Genesis 6:4, where it says, "There were Nephilim upon the earth in those days," and also after, when the sons of God went into the daughters of men. It is legitimate to possibly translate that phrase this way, because you have a particular particle with an imperfect verb form, blah, 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 blah. You could translate it, "There were Nephilim on the earth in those days and also after, whenever the sons of God went into the daughters of men." So that implies a continued activity. Now, if Paul in 1 Corinthians 11, when he talks about the head covering, and he gives this advice, and part of his advice is, quote, "because of the angels." Okay, if that shows, and I think it does, that Paul, at least in the back of his mind, considered this, some recurrence a possibility, or to state it negatively, he was kind of worried about that. That thought worried him. If that's the case, then you could use that to go back to Genesis 6:4 and say, well, it should be whenever, because they're thinking this could have happened, and it did happen later, because that's how we get Nephilim descendants after the flood. It happened again. Well, all of that is speculation. All three views are circumstantial in their nature, but that's pretty much what you're left with. That's the data you have at your disposal. So do with it what you will. But again, in the book, I go through all three of those, to
I haven't read your book
lay
yet,
it out.
but do you go into the Book of Enoch or anything like that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm actually working on a book now that the working title is "Subduing Hermon," and the subtitle is "The Importance of the Watcher's Story for New Testament Theology." The Enochian material bleeds into the New Testament in a number of places that are typically not recognized. They're recognized in scholarship, in academia.
Right.
But again, the way people typically talk about Bible stuff in church, you're just never going to get there. In fact, you'll be discouraged from going there. But
Right.
it's very
Actually,
evident.
The philosophy people are supposed to take theology courses as well, and so I was taking an Old Testament survey last semester, and the professor actually said that he thought it was sons of Cain, and I'm like, no, you got to check out the Apocrypha. It's really clearly something else.
Well, I would say check out Peter and Jude in your New Testament.
Yeah, I mentioned that too.
When in both of those descriptions, you have the angels imprisoned in chains and gloomy darkness. There's only one candidate for the angels that sinned. If you're looking for an angelic rebellion before creation or in between Genesis 1:1 and 1:2, go to Milton's Paradise Lost. You're not going to find that in the Old Testament. You do find that in Enoch. Okay, and there are a number of places besides that. That's the most explicit. And Peter even uses the verb, to send to Tartarus, which is right out of, again, the classical Greek version of the sin of the Titans, which involved cohabitation. There's just no way to argue for a non-supernaturalist view in that passage, because that material does not originate in the Old Testament. That comes from the Enochian version of this.
Right. What's interesting is in the Greek mythology, it was the Titans before the Deucalion, which is the flood. And then Jove,
you actually have
Jupiter.
two Titan stories. They get conflated in sort of
right.
the way Greek mythology is taught. But if you go into the classical literature, there's actually two versions of the story.
But what's interesting is Jove or Jupiter imprisoned them in Tartarus, which was like the same word that Paul used.
Yep. Yeah, you're not going to get that in the Old Testament. You're not going to get it in the Septuagint. Sorry.
I know.
I mean,
I know.
just.
I know time's short.
Direction.
Find all these parallels. I know time's short. I just wanted to get maybe one more, maybe two more questions in, really brief. Well, this last one might not be so brief, but that fancy smancy term, omnibenevolence. I guess, and I haven't read this personally, but this was mentioned by someone else. I think maybe Justin knows who. You referenced Robin Perry's book, Gregory MacDonald.
Yeah.
We had him on the show, a
Yeah,
previous show.
he's a good guy. I like him.
Super, super humble, yet super smart too. I really appreciated him very much. So, I mean, I don't know really the nature of the question or the quote that apparently is being referenced here, but I mean, what are your thoughts on the attribute of omnibenevolence? Oh, Justin, go ahead.
Can you hear me well now?
No, I can't hear. If you type it, I'll say it. But yeah, this is something that like Justin and I talk a lot about God's omnibenevolence, what form that takes, and I get the sense that this is kind of an entrance into evangelical universalism.
It depends on how it's defined, and that depends on whose perspective we're talking about. In other words, if we let God decide what His goodness means, that description, that answer is going to be different than if we decide what goodness means. And I think that's where the rub is. We want to. I hate to even quote anything that Rob Bell does, but this whole, love wins, kind of thing. Well, what about God wins? I mean, it just.
Wouldn't there be another way of doing this, saying that, on the one side, it doesn't have to be, you can have, eternal hell without God being evil, even by the human sense, because it could be, C.S. Lewis saying hell is like from the inside. It's something God saves people from. It's not something that God gets vengeful to. It's
Great Divorce style.
Yeah.
Even they feared the oncoming dawn.
Oh, I know, but what I'm saying is it's they're afraid of the outcome of what happens when they stay in their fallen state, and if they just continue on in the fallen state, that eventually terminates in hell, and it's not something that God does. Because I kind of worry about the converse problem of saying what Heiser just said there about God defining what his goodness means, is because then you end up with this sort of, and I've seen atheists react to this in a very negative fashion. It kind of takes, Nietzsche said God is dead, and then he had this whole issue of Nietzschean morality, of Nietzsche, like, master morality and slave morality, but in a way it kind of would make it worse than if God was dead, because then you'd have, instead of there being no God and thus no ultimate morality, you'd have God as making morality, but God's morality is basically Ubermensch morality. And it kind of like sucks all the meaning out of,
Well, I'm glad you added that, because I mean, if again, you can, is there any statement about God that atheists are happy with anyway?
right.
If they're going to take the terminology that anyone uses and bend the terminology, legitimately or illegitimately, to the direction they want it to go. So I don't worry too much about using terminology and worrying about what an atheist is going to do with it, because
right. I'm saying this as an example.
They're going to do the same thing.
I was saying this as an example because the reason is it's a, you can do it in a kind of an academic way of thinking about it, but it's also very practical, because, like, for example, this last year something happened that really, it seemed like God had essentially set me up and backstabbed me, and I basically, then when people would tell me, well, that's just God's prerogative, he gets to be the Ubermensch.
Well, that also assumes that, well, that assumes too that God is the causation behind everything.
Right. That I learned was not but that's the thing. I think it would be a better idea would be to say that there is eternal damnation. You don't have to go the universal route, but at the same time, it's not God doing it. It's just the outcome of the fallen state if God is not able to save someone, or God doesn't save someone.
Yeah, I mean, since I don't want to create the impression that I don't find any of this, troubling in some respect, because I wouldn't be human if I said that. But on the other hand, since I don't believe that God's knowledge and His foreknowledge necessitates predestination or causation, I probably have less problem in some respects with some of this. And what you just said to me sounds quite acceptable, because I don't see this, cause and effect relationship with everything that happens.
Right.
As though you have to lay it all at God's feet.
It was interesting because there was this one time Moreland was, I'm sure you're familiar with J.P. Moreland. He was in class, and he had a time when he was younger when he felt God was treating him badly, and he actually said he cussed God out. And then somehow the topic of Calvinism came up in the class, and he said about how God would create certain beings just to send them to hell, if that's what the Calvinists are saying. And then he goes on and he says something about if that's who God was, then God would exist, but he wouldn't deserve any love or any worship or anything like that. And you can see there's a sort of like this irate subtext in his voice, and I was like, "Oh, he's gonna step on some Calvinist toes with that."
Yeah.
We don't go there on this show anymore.
All right, hey, break through in here, lead the
Okay,
chat.
yeah, Justin has something to say.
I exited the broadcast, came back on, so can you hear
We
me
can
now?
hear you perfectly,
Okay,
homie.
that's awesome. Woo! Okay, as far as omnibenevolence, I wanted to say this real quick, and I know we want to close up, but what do you do with the fact that the only two, like, ontologically equivalent or equivocating, however you want to put it, it's late, statements in the Bible about God, about like what God is God is love and God is light. Say God is agape love. God is, ever loving. He's no respecter of persons in that regard. To me, that speaks omnibenevolence, and those aren't standalone. There's many other verses as well, but that's, like, to me, it's so precise and to the point. And of course, 1 Corinthians 13 as well.
How about a brief definition of omnibenevolence?
I would say omnibenevolence is God doing his utmost without restraint and doing good for all and without diminishment. And we could argue about whether that will bring everybody to God or not, but as far as
Why not just say that God only does good for people all the time?
Not as in what God's good is may be beyond our grasp at times.
Okay, that's fine, but that doesn't, semantics aside.
Okay,
God
so I think another way of saying about that would be that God would actually give everything good all the time. The catch is that because of the fallen state, he's not able to give it all at once, or maybe he's not able to give it in a fashion that doesn't end up being.
I'm not going to split hairs with you. All I'm saying is
example,
that in gift theory is really how it applies, is that everything that comes from God is necessarily good. That no evil, nothing like that can possibly come from God. That's the core. Let's just keep it simple,
Right. But what I'm saying is that, it seems like some bad things come to people, like, say, the situation with Job, and he thinks it's God's doing, and it's really not. And so the idea
why would we assume that God is the cause of those things? And again, I'm not saying that God can't be the cause,
but,
or that God couldn't permit someone else to be the cause, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
But I think when we get these questions, we operate again with this sort of assumption that everything that happens is, God's behind the person doing this.
Yeah.
Right.
And that just isn't, I don't think, a good picture. I mean, God shares. What I talk about in Unseen Realm is that I believe, freedom, and defined loosely as the ability to make an uncoerced decision. Some sort of true decision, that wasn't made for you. But since God has this attribute, he has it exhaustively and perfectly, but he shares his attributes with us, and it's necessary for humans to have that ability, else we would not be an imager of God. In other words, if you take that away, we could not be like him. We would be a false representation as opposed to a true representation of him. And so God is willing to go that route, so to speak, to share that attribute with humanity, knowing full well that because we lack his nature, that we will abuse it. But God is big enough to deal with that problem when it surfaces, and of course he knows that it was going to, and it did, and all that stuff. But he's big enough to still move his free will imagers, toward the destiny that he desires ultimately, and he will get the plan done. He'll get the job done. He doesn't need to predestinate every event, and he knew that from the beginning.
Right.
And if that's the case, then back to the whole idea that what God actually does, it is good. Even though we can take his goodness and turn it against ourselves and against him and against fellow imagers and whatnot, but it was still a good gift. So evil is what it is because we abuse God's good gift. and we have ourselves to blame.
That it's so interesting how how close you're coming to this. This ministry is called New Apologetics, and they're basically there's more to it than just what you've said there, but you're basically almost saying word for word. And there's
Are you guys New Apologetics?
no, we're not.
Christopher McHugh, you got to contact him on Facebook.
We're friends. We're friends with some of the people involved in that. But but anyway, but we can send you something on that later.
Sure,
But
yeah.
Just don't judge me by my company.
Anyway, I don't know what your time is looking like right now.
I need to get going, so
Okay.
I'll allow you to have a neat wrap up.
Cool.
Could you give us 30 seconds on New Perspective and NT Wright?
Sure, go ahead.
Oh, okay. Let me read the. I'll try to speed through this real quick. Basically, the New Perspective on Paul, like N.T. Wright's thing about how the works of the law that Paul mentions is not just like a general moral category of good deeds, but they're specifically the cultural practices of the Jews, and keeping kosher and circumcision and all that, and how he makes it that he identifies that as that specific thing rather than just general good deeds.
Well, rather than an effort to merit salvation.
Right.
Yeah, well, I tend to agree with that in this sense. I mean, you can never say that all Jews looked at the Old Testament law the same way. Okay, so let's get that out of the way.
Sure.
It's not monolithic, but I think you'd have to be a fairly unintelligent reader of the Old Testament to think that you could merit salvation before the God of Israel. You're asked to believe some simple things. Yahweh is the God of gods.
Mm-hmm.
He alone is the one that deserves worship, and we will worship no other. And that He has decided to be in a covenant relationship with us because He loves us. So if we believe that, then we will be grateful, and we will show our loyalty to Him because we believe it, not so that we merit some destiny from Him as though we put Him in our debt. So in that sense, I think Wright, his observations are important because it makes the Jews of Paul's day look less stupid. Okay, because
that's true.
They're just not that dumb. Okay, and again, I'm sure somebody could have believed that, but you'd have to be a pretty poor reader of Old Testament theology to think that way. And granted, after the exile, they're really sensitized toward adherence to Torah and idolatry because we don't want this to happen again and all that kind of stuff. But it still doesn't change the content, of their theology. Would a Jew really believe that they're putting God in their debt? Again, I doubt it. I doubt it. So I think Paul has a high view of the law, but he had a higher view of Jesus. And that becomes the focus of his message.
Cool. And as a final wrap-up to that point, I wanted to say that the law was actually given after God delivered Israel, so it was on top of God's relationship with Israel. It wasn't the basis of His relationship with Israel. So that's a very important distinction to make. Anyway, we're so glad to have you on tonight, and honored that you would take your time out, your busy schedule, to join us. And we covered so many topics tonight, and I wanted this to be a show where we had so many unique angles that aren't usually covered, and I think we accomplished that.
Yes, it's probably fair.
But anyway, you're invited back anytime you want. We may reach out to you in the future, but yeah, it would be cool, and we could cover even more topics than we. I mean, it's just so hard to fit it all in even just 2 hours, and but yeah, it's kind of bedtime here, so I guess that's it for the night. And I think we got to most things we wanted to, but there may have been a couple things that, and I apologize to anyone who wanted to, had some questions that went on unanswered, but yeah, I think it's been a pretty satisfying show, and yeah, we'll wrap this up. And were you gonna say anything? Oh, you want to give you have your website on your
Yeah, my website is drmsh. Dr as in doctor, MSH are my initials. Isn't that clever? drmsh. I did it because people couldn't spell my name right. So drmsh.com. That's my nerve center. So you can get to all the blogs, the podcasts, the books, the whole bit.
And I want to throw a plug for Naked Bible Podcast. It's amazing. There's so many other topics that are broached in there that I don't even get in all the videos that I see online. Oh, can I ask real quick? You said you had you did some lectures last year, the later part of last year, and that eventually you get the video up.
Yeah, the videos from the Missouri conference, there were 8 of them. Those are now on the YouTube channel.
Yes! Woohoo! I'll be watching those tomorrow.
Yeah.
All right.
Go to the Naked Bible YouTube channel and you'll find them there.
Cool. Oh, and I wanted to say one last thing. I don't know if when you're on what's the Firing Michael Brown show?
Yeah.
Line of Fire.
Line of Fire.
Firing Line of Fire.
I'm not there yet.
I was the guy who called in and asked you about the documentary hypothesis and stuff. And I threw in that little note, saying you saved my faith, and that's what I talked about tonight. So I was glad I got to give you a little more detail on that.
So that was you, okay.
Yeah.
Oh, I think Johanan is asking about Sitchin. No, he is no longer alive, if that's a serious question.
No, I think he was asking how much of it is valid.
He's alive in Hilbert space.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Justin, you're coming out again, and we're going to spiral out of control.
All right, we got to end the show here, but yeah, we'll maybe I'll post that excerpt that question I asked. But anyway, we'll let you scamper off, and I need to go to bed and stuff. My wife's in bed.
Thanks again. Thanks again. Good night, you guys.
Cool. It was nice talking.
Have a good night. It was a pleasure meeting you, sir.
Yep.
Thank you.
Just get your book today, actually.
Good. Sweet. I'll read it. Yeah. Bye.
All right, Justin. Do you want to close it, or you want me to? Because you're getting choppy again.
Go ahead.
All right. I'll do it. I was surprised that I even got on at all tonight because Adeline was absolutely insane, and I have the camera pointed up so you don't see Michelle sleeping right behind me. But yeah, this has been actually an exceptional conversation. It went far better than I thought it would. I have been following him for so long, and the beautiful thing about Dr. Heiser is that he speaks actual scholarship to subjects that everyone is always just postulating about, and really the spirit of the age is just, oh, well, this sounds really great and it seems to make sense, so let's go with it. And then you get these guys who do the thankless job of the legwork of sifting through the actual evidence at hand, and all too often get relegated to a corner of irrelevance when really they're the ones who know what they're talking about. So I for one, really super appreciate him taking his time to do this with us tonight and to put it on the lower shelf for those of us who don't quite get that really complicated, intricate stuff about the idioms of the culture and their mindset, looking through their eyes. And it's so easy to view Scripture anachronistically, as though King David was the kind of king that we see wearing a suit of armor and chainmail, rather than a dude sitting on a stump with a stick in his hand who's ruling a ragtag band of a nation that just formed out of nowhere. It's stuff like that that we need guys like Dr. Michael S. Heiser for. And I just can't say enough about how much I appreciate his work and everything that he's done. So in saying that, good night, everybody. Thank you for joining us, and maybe we might drive you a little crazy next week. You never know. We might start talking about paranormal stuff. Well, what, Johan? Come on, what? I was just about to go out epically, dude.
Paranormal stuff?
Yes, I love paranormal stuff. I keep trying to get everyone to talk about paranormal.
You know, we should get. I'm curious. Have we gotten any atheists on the show? Could really drive up the wall with this guy.
I don't know if Vince counts. Haley's definitely an atheist, but I don't know. I mean,
chickens. No, we need to taunt them.
Can we talk about this after I give the conclusion? Bye, everybody. This is how it always goes. Peace.